Welcome. This is Logan Cockrum with Action Coach Bluegrass in Southern Indiana, and you're listening to the Success Through Action podcast, where we're talking to successful business owners to hear their stories and how they took action to grow their businesses.
All right, Landon. So let's talk a little bit about Goodson Clothing Supply and who you are. Let us know.
Yeah, so I'm originally from Springfield, Ohio, moved to Louisville in 2013, worked for the family business that I was working for at the time for the first 2 years that I lived here, and started this company in 2015. There's a lot to that story. We probably don't want to get into a lot of that right now. It's like I joked with you when we met, probably calls for a little bit of bourbon to talk through that. But I've been in this, there's a lot of different ways that this industry is known. Some people know it as ad specialties. Some people know it these days probably more like they go by swag. There's just different ways that people know our industry, but we do branded clothing and promotional items for businesses to build their brand and try to create loyal customers and employees. And so hard to believe, really, we'll be coming up on 8 years in May in business. And I'm the owner. There's no one else right now, but we have about 7 employees and about 4 contractors. So a little more than 10 people that we're touching each day. And right now we're actually actively looking to add to the team, especially on the sales side and on some operations help too. And business has been good. We're really blessed.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit before this. Is your dad actively involved in the company? I know that we can go into the Ohio start. You were not always Goodson Clothing and Supply, right?
Yeah, so Dad is involved with the business now. And the short of it is, like I said, I grew up in Springfield, Ohio, which to orient people is between Columbus and Dayton, Ohio. It's about a 2.5-hour drive from Louisville. So I joined my father, and he'd been in the business since I was born in 1980. I joined him in 2003-04 timeframe after graduating from Cedarville University, which is a kind of a small Baptist Christian college up in Cedarville, Ohio, just south of Springfield. And, had gotten offers to do commission selling and stuff for other companies. Decided to go do it for Dad and worked with him for 11 years. That company was called the Cerium Group. Well, actually, when I joined him, it was called the Wade Company. So we started out as the Wade Company from probably 2003 to 2005 and rebranded and called it the Cerium Group, which is kind of an odd name, but cerium is an element on the periodic table. We wanted something pretty unique. It was easy to find URLs and 800 numbers and all that because it was a pretty unique name. And then we worked together for 11 years until I moved here. And I think Dad and I had always had a bit of a contentious relationship as a father and a son, and then you had the working part, and it wasn't easy. So, it was rough when I left, but thankfully, through kind of just a series of different things that have happened, he is working with me at Goodson, and we've got a pretty good relationship today, considering. It's pretty incredible, honestly, that we've gotten to that point, because there were times when I didn't know if that was possible.
Yeah. When we first met, man, there was a lot of topics that I could draw from our conversation for this, but I think I'm going to focus on 3 things today. And one of them that I think you would get a lot of play out of is the idea of overcoming obstacles. So the first question that I kind of want to dwell on here is, how has failure shaped your professional success?
Well, I think the way that I would answer that is, for me personally, I guess that's all I can really speak to, is ego and arrogance has, I think, been a big, big challenge for me over the years, and probably something that I didn't know that I was struggling with at the time. And I guess that's kind of how it goes, right? Like when you have that problem, if you knew it, you wouldn't have it, I guess, on some level. So one of the hardest things I did was ended up leaving my hometown and moving here. And there's a lot of layers to that conversation, but I married a girl from here. Her family was here, all of her brothers and sisters, nieces, nephews, mom, dad, everybody. And I've talked to a lot of guys who married women from different cities, and that tends to be the move that comes into play. And I think that I came kind of kicking and screaming, but in hindsight, I take my situation with my dad. The relationship was really difficult at the time. If you asked me, it was all him and everybody else, and if they just would have given me the keys, everything would have been great. And within 2 years of coming here, I had the opportunity to start my own business and realized relatively quickly that some of the same things that plagued me then were plaguing me still, as far as some of my challenges and some of my shortcomings. There's a lot of things I'm good at. There's a lot of things I'm not very good at. And so for me, it's probably, how's failure shaped me is it's humbled me. And there's a lot more ground to cover, I think, as far as needing to be more and more humble. And I know that's a word that's thrown around a lot and it's cliche, but what I have realized is I'm good at doing the work. I'm good at working with customers. A lot of that I've proven. Building a company is a wholly different thing. being able to hire people and treat them right and lead them and develop them and coach them and, and also at the same time be led and developed and coached myself. That's about the best way I can think to answer it. Sometimes you got to get knocked down. And I think I got knocked down a good bit, moving here and losing the business that I had helped my dad build and starting over and then trying to build this thing and learning a lot of my shortcomings. And I've been in a business that there's no outside funding, there's no other partners. And so there's not anything that would dull the experience, if that makes sense. In other words, there wasn't anything to mask where I was weak. If I was weak, it was pretty evident just because of, the immediacy of my interaction with the business. And it wasn't like there was a bunch of money in the bank to gloss over that. There wasn't any buffer. My weaknesses were really apparent. And so in those moments, it feels really bad. I mean, nobody wants to fail. It doesn't feel very good. But I also think I wouldn't necessarily change it because it's part of what shaped me to this point. And I hope will be part of what shapes me going forward and helps us to continue to be successful.
Yeah. So can I relate a story to you, Landon? Not to sound like I'm complimenting you too much, but on your notion that you're humble.
Sure.
So
please.
The first time I met you, I certainly don't have as much professional success as you, not even close. And the first time I met you for coffee to talk about this opportunity, we had a pretty engaging conversation and we had some dialogue back and forth. And I gave you an idea, right? I didn't know I was giving you an idea, but you took out a notebook and you wrote it down. And I don't think there's many people that are in your position that would take advice from me. And that's actually a really big compliment. I mean, that's not a knock on you. I think when you say, hey, I'm humble, a lot of people say they're humble and they're not. You're being honest when you make that comment.
Yeah, I appreciate that. One of the things I learned about myself over the years is it's something that I still struggle with today is that early on I learned from people, but I was like, I would decide who I would learn from, if that makes sense. So like, there would be these people I would decide, I can really learn from this person, or I would maybe see a person, and I hate to admit this, but I might see them and think, well, I can't learn much from them. And I'll be the first to say I think we talked about this. I'm a mess. As a person, I have a strong faith base, and what I do and what I have learned is in my faith walk, I guess I feel like I've been convicted to believe that, he's kind of like, you can learn from anybody and you need to be ready to do that. And I think even as I sit here today, there's still a lot of relationships that I have where I'm still progressing and trying to get past some of my own failings in terms of like, hey, it's not just something that I say that I believe I can learn from anybody, but it's something that I do and that I really, really believe literally anybody. So anyway, when you say that to me, I take that as well. There's obviously been some work done because there was a time in my life where I might not have done that.
And that's the hardest thing to learn, I think, but that's also one of the hallmarks of people that I've associated with that have had success, probably share some of that in terms of overcoming the ego barrier to learning.
Flipping back through my notes here, trying to see if I could find where, because I got my notebook in front of me. I have it with me everywhere I go, as you said, and I'm looking back through to see, so anyway, go ahead, sorry.
No, you're fine. So kind of on that, the topic of failure, what is the biggest issue you've had to overcome professionally? Is it maybe perspective, kind of like what we're talking about, or?
I think just dealing with people. I think getting good at managing people. And again, I know that runs the risk of sounding cliche and I think being a large bucket, but I mean, it is not an easy thing to be good at leading people and doing it in a way that you motivate them and that they feel like they really have a clear understanding of what we're doing, what's the vision, where are we going, and what's my role and what is expected of me. I think it's evidenced in my relationship with my dad even. It's just times my personality, and probably, on some level, some people that run companies, they can be, it takes a certain type of motor, it takes a certain amount of intensity, and sometimes that intensity can lead to it being a challenge to have good relationships with other people that then join the thing that you're trying to build. And so I think that's been the biggest challenge for me. And maybe secondary to that is being able to have a clear plan and go after a plan. Your greatest strength can be your greatest weakness. The greatest thing about entrepreneurs a lot of times is they're willing to hang the shingle out there and then just go try to build something that doesn't exist. And that takes a certain type of person to do that. But the irony of it is that if that thing is successful, the very thing that gave you the ability to do just that can sometimes then be challenging for you, because now with any success, an entrepreneur almost has to become a little bit more like an employee, because once you get other people involved, they don't function well when you just wake up and do what feels right the next day. They need you to have clear vision, clear plans. And then by doing that, you start to then sort of shackle yourself as the owner, because you have to start trying to lay out plans And then what that means is that you can no longer just do whatever you want to do. You have to start kind of setting up rules so that they feel comfortable and know what we're doing and why we're doing it. And then at the same time, I'm subject to that same thing. I don't know. I just find that really interesting. And that's been probably one of the challenges too, is just being able to take that part of me that got the thing started and then govern that down and reinvent myself a little bit into the role that I have to play now that we have other people involved.
So you're talking about your past self and your current self kind of in that respect of how you had to change a little bit. So a question for you based on that is, if you started your business again, what would you do differently?
Yeah, I think we actually talked about that day we met. I think I'd like to probably have more of a clear plan. And when I say that, like, I think maybe a clearer idea of what the archetype customer looked like and the type of value that we wanted to deliver, as opposed to, I was a little bit probably more of like a blue collar entrepreneur, if you will, where it was just like, just go, just act. And there's something to be said for that. There's a lot of value in just being willing to just like, man, this is the stuff that I sell, and I'm going to go get involved in events, and I'm going to meet people, and I'm going to tell them what I do and see if I can help them. I did that for a while. And then on the back end, I was like, it doesn't feel like there's any direction, like in all the clients, they're not similar, and there's no continuity between these customers. And so after the fact, I kind of backed into what I considered an archetype customer and tried to get clear on the value that we're delivering. But yeah, I think if I had it to do over again, I would just try to be really clear on what is the value that we bring and who do we feel it fits the best with, so that the efforts are very targeted and efficient. That's the only thing that I think I did. I wouldn't necessarily even say I did it wrong, because there's a place for all of it. But if your energy is not directed, then it can be inefficient. That's all I would say. And so I would just like to have a better direction so that energy is very efficiently used.
One of the things that I've noticed about successful people is almost all of them, this idea that we're all self-made, people have success just based on their own self-actualization, which is slightly true. I mean, you have to work really hard to get anywhere. But a question for you is, who helped you along the way?
Man, we'd have to do another show, man. I have been very fortunate along the way to have had some people who have gone before me and done the things that I want to do, spend time with me. But at the same time, I've been proactive and reached out to different really successful people and asked if they'd have coffee or lunch or whatever. And I try to listen to and assimilate and apply the things that they tell me. The one thing that I think I've learned, really successful people really like to spend time with younger folks that are trying to accomplish similar things. Where they get frustrated is, I think a lot of times people do that, but then they don't actually apply the things that they're told. I think that's very frustrating for successful people when they spend time with others, is that, they feel like that person's just checking a box to spend time with me. And somehow it's like they read a book that said, get with successful people, and I check the box, but I don't listen, and I'm not actually doing things that they recommend that I do. So I've had a lot of that. But I mean, beyond that, man, I've got a great wife. She has been incredibly supportive, and we've got, I think, a clear understanding in our relationship of the roles that we each play. And she allows me the freedom to go and play my role, is what I would say. She's got an incredibly hard job, and we've been fortunate enough for her to be home, be with our girls. But that is a really thankless job, and probably a job I couldn't do. But then I have a clarity on what I'm supposed to do. Really, when I transitioned out of my family business, my brother-in-law stepped in, and he's been very successful over the years in a very, very clear way. I mean, he stepped alongside me and helped to reduce some of my risk of starting this company. And those are just all little things along the way. It's like, I believe in the idea of self-made, and I certainly believe that from the standpoint of somebody being willing to step out and take risk and go create something from nothing, there's definitely an initial burst of energy that is needed from certain types of people to do that.
Yep.
But for anything to be a sustained success, it just simply is not something that a single person can do very often.
Who has been your greatest mentor or coach or influence, and why?
Well, I had a guy, his name's Mark Holdeman. Mark and I met when I was working with my dad's business. Mark consulted with us. Mark and I, we don't do it as much anymore. We spent hours and hours and hours and hours talking when I was with Dad. And it was a lot of, again, worldview conversation. How do you reconcile the faith that you claim and the way that you think that dictates that you need to do business, and how you actually do business? He's one that comes to mind immediately just because of how close our relationship is. And then in a weird way, and I haven't spent a lot of time with this guy, but I think sort of indirectly through his books, and I've spent time with him on the phone a half a dozen times. I met with him a couple times in person, a guy named John Beckett. John wrote a book called Loving Monday. He wrote a book called Mastering Monday. He runs, or his family, I think he still pretty much runs the company in Elyria, Ohio, called the R.W. Beckett Corporation. John is a really strong Christian guy, and he runs a company that is I think they're well over $100 million combined revenue, big company. And he's a guy who I was very fortunate to get to know through Cedarville University. And he spent time with me, like I said, in person a handful of times and on the phone. But yeah, those are two names that come to mind immediately.
Kind of segue into the next question. What are the most influential books you've read?
Well, I think How to Win Friends and Influence People is a must read for anybody. I think you and I talked about sort of this art and science pendulum that swings on a lot of things. So you take like the Bible as an example, or just ways that you would advocate for treating people in the Bible. I think it takes some of that and sort of distills it down into something that's relatively scientific. What are certain principles? I believe so strongly in that success is largely determined by people's ability to deal with other people, that book is an absolute must read. And then Start with Why is a book that really, I know that, again, that's a very like sort of, culturally popular book right now, but I like it because I think it very much ties into our philosophy, which is people do business with people of like mind. So like, understanding your personality as a company and then your marketing, sort of putting that out there so that you tend to attract people who think similar. And those are two books that come to mind immediately that I think are really excellent.
So this next topic is something that I really wanted to talk to you about, because I thought our conversation mostly revolved around this concept that I think it's something you can't teach, and it's something that's hard to implement in business, and it's authenticity. Being authentic and genuine. Kind of back to your topic of humbleness, I think that's kind of related to it in some respects. It's if you enter in let's say a sales meeting with a potential prospect and you're humble, that changes the dimension of the conversation. Same thing with being genuine and authentic. So why do you think authenticity is important in business today?
I think that people can sense it. They sort of can smell fakeness. And I think there's a lot, especially with the advent of social media and everything, I think we live in a very much today, and sometimes what can feel like a very packaged world where people are putting forth small snippets of these sort of idealistic representations of lots and lots of things. So I think because that's become so ubiquitous in our culture, I think people hunger for realness. I think that's why reality TV, which isn't really reality, but the idea of real things. You talk to a lot of marketing people and they talk about how unscripted, unedited videos and different things get a lot of interaction because the people at least perceive that it's real. And so I think people just hunger for real. They sort of almost intuitively know when something isn't real. Although we've gotten pretty good at faking it in our culture to where you can trick people for a time. But even that, I think over enough time, they can figure it out. For me, it's like we talk a lot about here, we genuinely love the customer. And again, I think that could come off as kind of, but I know how hard it is to get them. I know how hard it is to keep them. And I know how easy it is for them to go somewhere else. Now, it's like your family. You love them. You don't always like them, but you always love them. And in loving them, it just means you have an appreciation for the fact that I'm not entitled to them and I'm not guaranteed to have them. And that we have to do a really good job and make sure we're holding up our end of the bargain to get them and keep them and genuinely appreciate them. And I think in doing that, what we want to do is make sure with our customers, we want to tell them what we know. We don't want to act like we know things we don't know. And most of all, we want to make sure that they understand that we have their best interest in mind and that we are here to be a partner of theirs to give them the information they need to make decisions and be willing to say when we know something and be willing to say when we don't know something. Because to me, that is what builds trust, and that ultimately is what builds strong relationships. And in a business like ours, where we're in a very populated space, a very crowded space, lots of places, as I told you when we met, our industry doesn't have product problems. There's plenty of products, and there's plenty of places for people to get them. But for us, that authenticity and being real is really a big part of how we build really good relationships with our customers that creates the ability to work with them, hopefully, as long as that person's at that company. So it just creates long-standing relationships with customers.
A good question based on that is, how does a business balance the need to be authentic in their approach and the need to make profit? Because I feel like a lot of people view authenticity as it's like an opportunity cost for them. They see the quick method and they have bills, obviously. They have overhead that they have to make, right? So it's not the shortest path often, but it could theoretically be the most lucrative.
Yeah, that's a really good question. What's funny is I guess I've just never been smart enough or wired to understand how to make a quick buck. I watch some of these things on TV sometimes and I'm like, you see these schemes that people put together to make money, and you're like, man, I mean, and this is not to say that I'm some great person. I'm just like, literally, like that would have never occurred to me to think to do that, let alone do it. I think some of it might just be self-preservation, being practical. So for example, one time I remember I had a client of mine that he was a really good friend of mine in my hometown, and he told me, he said, one of the things I really appreciate about you is that I know you take care of me. And he knew who my biggest customer was. He's like, I feel you take care of me just like you do them. And I said, Rob, I really appreciate that you said that, but some of it is just practical, meaning I just created a to-do list each day, and I went after each item with the same. I didn't govern my response to the to-do list item based on the size of the order. If they were a customer and they asked me to do something and I said I was going to do it, I just went after it with the same level of energy. Some of it, I think, it'd be easy to construe that into some kind of virtuous reason, but also some of it was just, that was the way I kept my sanity, was I just worked down the list. And I think by doing that, over time, I learned that it all comes out in the wash, so to speak. So, I'm going to work my fingers to the bone to make a little bit of money on this one. And then next week, I'm going to do far less effort. And I'm going to make a lot of money. But by the end of the year, I'm going to have received a fair value for value return, generally speaking. And I think by then doing that myself, it made it easy for me to then coach our people similarly. Hey, sometimes you're going to feel like you're working your fingers to the bone for a relatively low return, and then later you're going to get a really high return on a relatively low amount of effort. But when it all blends together, trust me, by the time the dust settles, you will get a good return, and the customer will as well. And that's something that I said early on, was I always wanted to trade value for value. I wanted to make sure I had a business and relationship with my customers where we traded value for value. They felt like they got a fair value, and we felt like we got a fair value, because that to me that's a healthy business relationship. I see business relationships all the time that are unhealthy, and they're sort of codependent. Like the client knows they're taking advantage of the partner, and the partner knows they're being taken advantage of, but the client can't find the service elsewhere for anywhere near what they're getting it here for. But this person on the other side providing the service doesn't want to do the work to go find the clients that they really need to be working with. And so they sort of dislike each other, and it's this very unhealthy codependent thing. And I really just wanted to make sure we didn't have those kind of relationships. I wanted to enjoy those relationships. And if we've done anything really well, I do think we've done that. We have really healthy relationships with our customers. And generally, I feel like they feel like we trade value fairly on both sides.
How do you ensure that authenticity permeates the organization? So like, how do you hire employees? What's your hiring process? How do you ensure that they're both genuine and represent your culture?
Well, you'll recall I said I got 7 people and like 3 or 4 contractors. So there's not a ton of experience doing it. And I'll be honest, we haven't done it well, but we're working harder to get better at it. And I do think we've gotten incrementally better every time. It is a hard thing to measure for, to be honest, but some of it is just that you got to have a process where you relate with people as much as you can without dragging the process out too long. Matt, who I just hired in December, he would tell you that it took like 6 months to hire him. And unfortunately, he's probably not wrong. And part of that was because I had done it wrong in times before, and I wanted to spend time with him and kind of got a sense of who he was. And he's been great. But there's been times in the past where, I hired a lady a while back, and I just didn't spend enough time with her. And she got in, and it just wasn't a good fit. And I think that's the thing, too, is I'm gaining an appreciation for how important cultural fit is. So it's like, then starting to your point, starting to devise a way to evaluate a person on these intangible things that would mean culture fit, as opposed to can they sell, can they do like these tasks? It's obviously much easier to measure people's intelligence or ability to do tasks than it is to measure their sort of makeup as a human being and how that aligns with your culture. So to be honest with you, we're working through that right now. It's pretty subjective. It's pretty much like just spending time with people and trying to see whether there's a continuity relationally. But we're trying to refine that process as we speak, as we look to add to our sales team and to our operations team. It's not easy.
No,
and to be honest, some of it is trying to get clear on, if I turn the thing back around on myself, I think sometimes we think we know what's important to us. We think we know what we value and how we want that. And then we learn over time, well, I thought it was this, but it's really this. So, there's sort of this process too of self-discovery and clarifying what you're really looking for.
Well, you want to steer clear of trying to find carbon copies of yourself too.
Right.
If that makes sense.
For sure. It does.
'Cause you're never going to find yourself.
Right.
You might find elements of yourself, but the other elements that aren't you are what is going to make them great employees. But that's another topic. But I got one last question for you, Landon, and I'll stop stealing your time. So If I could remove all barriers and constraints, what project would you do? And would you want to be known only by that project?
Ooh. Oh man, I'm trying to think of how to take that, because on one hand, I could answer it in regards to our business. There were no barriers or constraints to me, meaning money was not an issue and I could sort of make the investments that I want to make. I would make a very significant investment in a facility and equipment to take and move in-house a lot of our decoration and do a lot of warehousing, and basically just really invest heavily in our ability to elevate the customer experience on some of the types of projects that we do, and then immediately go and hire a handful of people. Not that we're not executing on just that, but you have to do it a little bit more methodically when you're bootstrapping the company. But if you threw that all off and it was just like, hey, you sort of have unlimited resources tomorrow. Personally, if it was like, hey, you can do anything you want, I have always, and this is a thing that a lot of people do, so this isn't really unique, but I have always loved old stuff. I love old buildings. If I had money in the bank and you said, you do what you want to do, I would do two things. I would start scouting old buildings that I could buy and rehab without stripping away the character of the original construction, keep brick walls. And again, there's people doing just these things, but my heart beats a little faster when I go into an old building. Like I was over in southern Indiana just the other day and went into what I think was an old Masonic lodge, and somebody has turned that into their corporate offices. I just love that. And then in addition to doing that, I'd probably have an antique shop where I just go around and find cool old stuff and put it in there and almost don't care if anybody buys it or not. Because it's just, I don't know why, I just have an affinity for these old things, leathers and woods, and just the way furniture used to be made and just the way things used to be made. And if money were no object, that's probably what I would spend my time doing.
All right, Landon, I appreciate you being on today, and I wish you all the best for the rest of 2023 and the rest of your day, and thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, man, I really appreciate you having me. I enjoyed it.
To everyone who tuned into this episode, thanks for listening to the Success Through Action podcast. Make sure to take action, and I'll see you next time.